Sometimes the wildest stories aren't in movies or novels. They're buried deep inside court documents. And what started as one woman's legal trouble in Florida has now spiraled into this massive federal lawsuit that could honestly challenge the very limits of a judge's power. Just picture this for a second. You're sitting in a courtroom and you hear those words being read out loud. Now imagine they're being said about you. But here's the kicker. You are not on trial. You're not even a witness. Those words, pulled directly from a court transcript, were spoken by a sitting judge about a private citizen. So that begs a huge question, right? How did we even get here? To really understand the explosive lawsuit that came next, we have to break down what happened piece by piece. Okay, so this whole story really centers on a series of confrontations inside a public courtroom that just kept escalating. So the guy whose private history was just put on blast for the whole court to hear, that's Rusty Miller. And get this, he wasn't the defendant, he wasn't a lawyer, not even a witness. He was just a regular citizen, there in court to support his friend, Kelly Lynch. According to the court transcripts, the judge's focus suddenly just shifted entirely over to Miller. Right from the bench, he accused Miller of committing a crime called unlicensed practice of law, which is basically just giving legal advice when you're not a lawyer. He called him a knucklehead, warned he was going to cost his friend 80 years in prison, and then, and this is wild, he forced the actual defendant to swear an oath to stop talking to Miller about her own case. Okay, so you've got to be wondering, how in the world does a private citizen become the main event in someone else's criminal hearing? Well, it all goes back to the case that brought them to court in the first place. So Rusty Miller's friend, Kelly Lynch, she was the actual defendant. She was facing a few charges, but the key one you need to remember for our story is the fraudulent use of personal identification information. Remember that exact charge because, believe me, it becomes the smoking gun. And now the story pivots. We're moving from the courtroom drama to the cold, hard evidence on paper. Because at the very heart of Miller's lawsuit is a huge, glaring discrepancy between what the jury actually decided and what the judge's order says. Let's set the scene. The date is September 25th, 2020. Kelly Lynch's trial is over, and the jury files back into the courtroom. They've reached a verdict, and they've filled out a special form with their findings. Now, this is absolutely crucial. On that verdict form, the jury makes a very specific distinction. They found Lynch guilty of possessing personal information with the intent to use it, but, and they were explicit about this, they found she did not actually use it. Under Florida law, that distinction is everything. It makes the crime a less severe third-degree felony. But then, you look at this. This is the official order of probation, signed by Judge Madrigal himself, and it says Kelly Lynch was found guilty of fraudulent use, and it classifies the crime as a first-degree felony. That is a flat-out contradiction of what the jury explicitly found. And we're not just talking about legal jargon here. The difference is stark. The jury's finding meant a third-degree felony with a maximum of 5 years. The judge's order, though, was for a first-degree felony, which carries a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence. The real-world consequences are just massive. So the obvious question is, could this have just been a simple mistake? A clerical error in a busy courthouse? Well, the lawsuit that Miller filed alleges that this was no mistake at all. And this timeline is what lays out their argument for why it was intentional. Get this. Court transcripts from the morning of that same day in a completely different case show Judge Madrigal acknowledging that possession with intent is in fact the lesser third-degree felony. Just hours later, the Lynch jury returns with that exact finding. And yet, that same afternoon, the judge signs the order sentencing her for the much more severe first-degree felony. The timing is just staggering. So it's this entire sequence of events, the public shaming, the accusations, this huge sentencing discrepancy that led Rusty Miller to do something that very few citizens ever do. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the judge, the prosecutor, and others. Now, you have to understand, suing a judge is incredibly difficult because of this powerful legal shield called judicial immunity. It's a doctrine that basically says judges can't be sued for the decisions they make from the bench. The whole idea is to let them rule independently without fear of personal lawsuits. But, and this is a huge but, that shield isn't absolute. Miller's lawsuit tries to pierce that shield in two main ways. First, it argues that investigating and shaming a private citizen are not legitimate judicial acts, so immunity shouldn't even apply. And second, it claims the judge had no jurisdiction over Miller in the first place, who was legally just a stranger to the whole proceeding.
And then, the lawsuit deploys its most powerful weapon, a RICO claim. Yeah, RICO, as in the law that's usually reserved for taking down organized crime. But here, it alleges that the judge's actions weren't just errors, but a coordinated pattern of racketeering activity by a corrupt enterprise designed to obstruct justice. So why are legal analysts watching this case so closely? Because honestly, a victory for Miller could set off a legal earthquake. This case is about so much more than one judge and one citizen. It's a direct challenge to the modern limits of judicial immunity. A successful RICO claim against a court system would be almost unprecedented. And what makes it all so potent is that the core evidence isn't someone's memory of what happened. It is the court's own black and white official transcripts. So why does this matter to all of us? Well, legal experts watching this say that a victory for Rusty Miller wouldn't actually tear down the judicial system. In fact, they argue it would reinforce it. It would send a clear message that accountability applies to everyone and that the power of the judiciary is ultimately accountable to the Constitution. And ultimately, this whole lawsuit poses a question that goes way beyond one Florida courtroom. When the guardians of the law become the ones who violate it, where do citizens turn for justice? That's the question the federal courts must now answer.